Afternoon, everybody. Hope we're all doing all right. Uh, I am sad to announce the passing of a dear friend today. Uh, my go to record store guru, Tony from Cheapo Records, has passed. And I called today to get some 10-inch sleeves because my wife is going up to the city. Sadly, I don't live in that neighborhood anymore. I now live about 80 miles away from that record store. But he was I've probably bought 5,000 records from the guy over the course of the last 30 years, going back to 1995, 96 when Cheapo was still on Grand Avenue and Lake Street. Uh, he was just a great conversation. He was always very amicable and would chat about music. He was always had a dislike for audiophile people and them returning stuff for the smallest of imperfections. And I think I gained some of my distaste for audiophiles through him. His lamenting they're never talking about the music and just wanting to show off their gear and uh, having 5 copies of the same record. And like he just always found them really annoying and haughty and pretentious. I'm sure that rubbed off on me in terms of my opinions of them. He hated people who would loiter around and pull out 100 records from the bins, listen to some of them, and then buy like one thing or sometimes even nothing, meaning that stuff all had to be refiled. But most importantly, he just loved talking music. And we all have our days where people are unapproachable and you can just give them their space in those days. But for the most part, he was always a great conversation and some guy I chewed the fat with and learned a lot from. And if I ever wanted to know if a record was as rare as my perception of it was, he was the great guy to call and be like, hey, when's the last time you saw this? Have you ever seen that? And Tony's been doing this stuff a long time. He was in bands for a long time. And he's been running record stores since the 70s. And if he had never seen something, it was rare. I remember I showed him my Bethlehem 10-inch catalog when I completed the 10-inch sequence. And he said he hadn't seen probably about half of them. So it shows you how rare Bethlehem 10 inches are here in the upper Midwest. But it's just I was shocked. It still stings a little. He's a guy I popped into and chatted with so many times over the last 30 years. As a resource, as a friend, as a guy who loved music and knew a lot, had met a lot of the celebrities from Paul McCartney to Ozzy Osbourne to the rock and roll, like metal guys, to, a lot of the classic rock people. In stores used to be a big thing. He met a lot of people and knew a lot of faces, and he could often tell you if someone was pretentious and stuck up or very friendly and social and down to earth. And that down to earth quality I find to be very important in me loving a musician. Someone who's too pretentious and takes himself a little too seriously sometimes, it can be a little tough. You have to sit on a really tall altar for me to be willing to bow down. You know what I'm saying? You better come with some knowledge and some wisdom and some insight and some experience. You know what I mean? The Bob Dylans and John Lennons and Bob Marleys, they're few and far between in this world. They're hard to come by. So, it's sad, and it's kind of out of left field. He's had health issues over the last 10, 12 years, but he had lost a lot of weight. He had a heart attack probably 10 years ago, and he was doing pretty good. And I guess this is associated with some kind of a fall and maybe a stroke. The record store didn't have a lot of details to offer me, sadly. But rest in peace, Tony. May your journey continue to be bathed in the music of the cosmos. May your path be protected by the light that you shared with all of us. You will always be remembered, and I'm greatly taken back by your passing. So rest in peace, my friend. I just called her today, trying to get some 10-inch inners and outers, sleeves for some 10 inches I got. 10 inches often don't come with paper sleeves on the inside. The records are just jammed in there in the cardboard, and they often don't have the right poly outer sleeves either. They just have them in a 10-inch sleeve or 12-inch sleeve taped up, or sometimes just in loose. So it's often hard to get 10-inch accessories, and they always had them there, which was always great. So anyway, I'm gonna move on, but tough loss. I really And the next question is, what happens to Tony's collection? Tony had one of the biggest record collections that I knew of. And I know that he had thinned it out some over the years, but what happens to our vinyl when we pass? And if you pass suddenly and haven't made arrangements for that, I mean, your family is going to end up probably selling it at pennies on the dollar to some, new store owner. I hope he had preparations made for that, because I know he didn't just collect stuff he loved. He also had brought home some collectible stuff that he knew was rare and expensive. He would always pay, good money for this stuff, but he had some gold nuggets in that collection of his. He wasn't a jazz guy, super. I mean, he liked some jazz. He knew a lot about it. If he was a jazz guy, I'd probably be looking for his sister's phone number right about now. But he was mostly a rock and roll guy. But again, my heart hurts. I love the guy. So we talked my 20s last episode. We only got 6 artists deep before the episode just got too long-winded. I didn't want it to go any further. So today we're going to talk about some more of my 20s influences, records that really impacted me a lot. And I'm going to go with Tom Waits next. I'm a huge Tom Waits guy. The Heart of Saturday Night, those early records, Closing Time, Into the Nighthawks at the Diner. I mean, those records are beautiful, beatnik poetry. He hasn't quite developed that gruff, gravelly tone, and by the time he's at Mule Variations, he's a different character for sure. But even the characters he played in film sometimes, I feel like helped us understand who he was as an artist, Tom Waits. My favorite Tom Waits period is clearly, to me, his era when he was just after Nighthawks. I love Nighthawks. The Naga Haibus and all that stuff's great. But the Foreign Affair, Small Change, Heart Attack and Vine, Blue Valentine, those late 70s records to me are just wonderful, wonderful experiences. And I think I'm going to go with Small Change as my favorite Tom Waits. But it's really hard to pick. And he made good records in the 90s and the 2000s up to recent. Like, he's still making cool stuff. Blood, Angel, Blood and the Blood Money, and Dirty Angel. What are those 2 records? And Mule Variations. And I have most everything the guy did. So here's Small Change. Pasties in a G-string. And The Piano Has Been Drinking. It's one of my favorite songs of all time. The piano has been drinking, not me. Imitation of the Blues is just amazing. The One That Got Away, Small Change, Tom Troy, yeah, the whole thing, man. Step Right Up is brilliant. He's like this salesman guy. Huge fan of Tom Waits. His lyrics, his storytelling are really unrivaled. We'll just flip through his canon here just because we can. Swordfish Trombones from the early 80s. Very interesting piece. Mule Variations from probably 98, 99. Heart Attack and Vine. Great stuff. There's Nighthawks at the Diner. One of the best live records you'll ever come across. Blue Valentine's, a favorite of mine. Foreign Affairs. Great stuff. Bad As Me. This one's fairly recent, probably 2011, so not so recent. 29, I think it was called Glitter and Doom. It's a live record. 04 is Real Gone. Alice from 02. And then Blood Money from 02. Heart of Saturday Night, which is the second record from 74. Closing Time from 73. Rain Dogs, absolutely great. Here's a 12-inch of Hang On St. Christopher, which is fun. Frank's Wild Years. I mean, I love Frank's Wild Years. One from the Heart. There's probably a few more albums of his laying around here somewhere. Not to mention his box sets, which are on CD. I have some of those as well. Big Tom Waits guy. One of the great storytellers of all time. Moving on. Pink Floyd. I'm going to give an honorable mention here. They really should be on the list because I've listened to them a lot. Sorry, the dust. Probably Wish You Were Here. You know, Floyd, of course, has a big canon. I'm not even going to try to pull them all. But the first Floyd record here on Tower, the American pressing, with, of course, Sid Barrett's big influence, was a pretty big influence on me. Saucerful of Secrets is actually an album I loved. I did a lot of LSD to this record. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Let There Be More Light, A Saucerful of Secrets. It's a record I really spent a lot of time zoning out to and in my meditative state, as it were. They've really hit their stride, of course, with Dark Side. Metal was a classic. Wish You Were Here is probably the record I've listened to the most. And I love the title track, but I also love Welcome to the Machine. The automation of that, the synthesizers and that are just killer. And then, of course, Shine You Crazy Diamond is one of those great atmospheric, planetarium-like songs. The Division Bell, of course, without Roger Waters. Momentary Lapse was also great. I spent a long time listening to The Wall, Delicate Sound of Thunder. Some of their 80s, 90s records are pretty tough to come by. I bought Division Bell when it came out. And in my mind, sometimes I still think of that as the new Pink Floyd record. It came out in 1994. So, time marches on, Steve Miller, don't it? Crazy stuff. So, I had a pretty big Zappa phase for a while. And I have probably 40 or 50 Zappa records. It's, you know, a section that wide. And I do want to mention Absolutely Free, Rolling In It for the Money, and Freak Out. Those first three Mothers records were three of my favorite records of all time. The way he's making fun of the hippie scene while it's happening shows some real prescience and some insight on Zappa's part. He was never one to really follow the crowd or be part of the herd or to look like anybody else in that herd. Zappa always had his own modus operandi, as they say. And those first records, I just love the comedic, sarcastic, ripping apart of the American flesh. I mean, he really dives hard, even at the altruistic hippie movement. He's tearing it apart. He makes fun of the political structure. He makes fun of the suburbanites. He pretty much is an equal opportunity ripper. And there's a tongue-in-cheek present in those early records that never drifts too far from his stream of thought. Whether you're thinking about Joe's Garage and the Central Scrutinizer, or a Tinseltown Rebellion, which has some of the most incredible musicians on it, Zappa always housed some of the greatest musicians, studio cats. I enjoyed the stuff with the guys Flo and Eddie from the Turtles in the mid-'70s. That stuff was fun. Apostrophe. I mean, there's a lot of great Zappa records. Sadly, he's not someone I listen to much anymore. And if I do go back to Zappa, it's pretty much that early stuff, Freak Out. The stuff that was on Verve, believe it or not. Verve wanted to expand into rock and roll in the late 60s because jazz was becoming so marginalized. So when you think about Zappa signing the Velvet Underground and the Mothers of Invention, those are fairly out parameters of the rock and roll world that they decided to sign, and probably not the most commercial artist that they could have found either. So again, Zappa, he deserves a mention in there because he was a big part of my life for a few years, diving into Uncle Meat and the 200 Motels and Weasels Rip My Flesh. There's just, it's an impressive canon, the Zappa catalog, a massive body of work, and it's something that, like the Dead, they'll probably be issuing live stuff and guitar tracks. And Frank wasn't a drug addict, he wasn't an alcoholic in spite of his freakiness. He was a pretty sober, straight, serious musician. Fired musicians for showing up wasted or high. And from the sounds of it, he spent most of his leisure time recording music in his basement. I read one of his autobiography, I think it was, and he talks about having this red light in there that if that was on, do not disturb me, wife. Leave me alone, children. I'm doing Zappa things. So I always loved and respected Zappa's work a lot. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit here. So it was about this time in the mid-90s, 96, 97, that I discovered this book. And it's called The Great Rock Discography by MC Strong. And it's a thick book. And it's a book I highlighted and got to know. I called it my Bible for the longest of times. And it was pressed in England, if I remember. So it's got a bit of a British UK skew to it. But it certainly includes all the classic rock, alternative rock, 80s, 90s, some metal stuff, but not the cheesy metal. But it's a pretty in-depth book of discographies of each artist, singles, 45s, LPs, EPs. And as a guy collecting vinyl, CD book issues didn't do me any good by Penguin. And there was no internet in the 90s. There was no easy way to access, an artist's complete body of work. How did you know how many records they had? When did they come out? What was the sequence? How did they chart? And shut up, dog. So this book provided me a lot of insight into bands like The Cure and Cult and George Clinton. You know what I mean? Miles Davis made it in here. There's Miles right there, actually. There's a few sketches. And so this is part of what led me into jazz, was getting to know this book and filling out all his discography. And I don't think Coltrane makes it, believe it or not. But Miles definitely did. There's a few other jazz artists, but there was also some R&B artists. And the rhythm and blues stuff, soul, funk, George Clinton, Commodores, that stuff was something I was really kind of ready for. And Sly Stone, I think, was the next big leap for me. If you ever come across this book, it's a worthy thing to grab. It's very insightful and will teach you a lot. But it was Sly Stone. I remember watching a documentary about, I think it was Monterey, and the impact of Sly Stone and how even Miles Davis was taken aback by the kids' response to Dance to the Music and Stand and all these great energetic songs that had the crowd going nuts. Sly is a fantastic chapter in the music history. If you don't know Sly Stone, his late 60s, early 70s work, it's penultimate stuff. It's really high level, high quality. Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself, Dance to the Music. There's a ride going on. There's some serious stuff. Fresh, which actually comes out after the Sly Stone Greatest Hits. So you don't really get to know that record because it came out after the Greatest Hits, where most people start. And I think I pulled Sly Stone's Greatest Hits here somewhere. But let me take a look real quick what I got. Definitely one of the most listened to records in my collection. Just the title tracks. I Want to Take You Higher, Everybody's a Star, Dance to the Music, Everyday People, Stand, Fun, You Can Make It If You Try, Hot Fun in the Summertime, Sing a Simple Song, My Lady, and Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself. Every song here is killer stuff. And it doesn't give you the mid-70s material, which you have to kind of discover on your own, because Fresh is a great record. If you want me to stay, I'll be around today. Take a message over to you. I think that shit's killer, man. But Sly Stone was a gateway for me. And it really opened up the Pandora's box to me for a lot of records by artists that I really dove into heavily. And I'll show you a few more. So I think one of the next records I really dove into deeply was this fantastic Al Green record. I talked about Al Green not too long ago, one of the great soul singers with that gospel funk, that Memphis sound. Let's Stay Together is one of the great soul records of the era. And it's one of the records in this genre that I find easy to listen to all the way through. A lot of R&B records will tend to have some filler tracks for my taste. But this is just such a solid, great piece. The version of the Bee Gees, How Do You Mend a Broken Heart, is just absolutely fantastic. Ain't No Fun to Be Me, one of my favorite songs. I've Never Found a Girl's Killer. So you're leaving. The horns will teach you. Shut up, dog. The horns will teach you about arrangements. It's fantastic stuff. And then you follow it up with the greatest hits of his. And Tired of Being Alone, Call Me, I'm Still in Love with You, Here I Come and Take Me, Love and Happiness. It's just, a lion's share of some of the greatest soul songs ever written. Stevie Wonder was one of the next guys, and I'd kind of been diving into Motown. And even as a kid in Canada, I remember seeing Motown, hearing Motown briefly. It wasn't like I had large access to it, but I remember there was some animation thing I saw. I don't know if it was Disney or what that was doing this animation to a lot of those Disney songs. Not Disney songs, but those Motown songs like what's it called? Heat Wave, and a lot of those great songs. There was this cartoon thing I watched that made me kind of know those songs. And I was probably 10, 12, 11, 13 in there somewhere. And so I knew Motown, early Temps, Four Tops, Supremes, but not well. But I knew about Motown. And so I dove into Motown kind of next. And of course, Talking Book and Songs in the Key of Life and Inner Visions. These were records that, again, front to back are just incredible. Great social commentary and one of the great leaders of that era. Curtis Mayfield's Superfly is probably the greatest soul funk record ever made from front to back. It's just an incredible fucking piece that I never tire of listening to. And this is a James Brown greatest hits that has a lot of his cool early 70s funk giants. Soul Power, you need that. You need Soul Power. That's a killer track. Cold Sweat, Make It Funky, Sex Machine. I mean, I Got a Brand New Bag, Give It Up or Turn It Loose. These are all songs that killed dance floors and still do. James Brown is very transcending through generations, in part because it's so simple. And because it's been sampled and resampled and reused, and it shows up in films and soundtracks. So I feel good. It's every generation can relate to that and get it. And so this is kind of opening up to R&B soul music. Was Al, was Stevie, Curtis, and then of course Marvin Gaye. And once I fell in love with Marvin Gaye, again, it was a bit of a Pandora's box because it's that soft crooning of that velvety toned voice with that wonderful 70s era funk Motown production. And it's funkier than that 60s Motown. And of course, this record's one of the great records. And Ooh Baby, You Sure Love the Ball is one of my favorite songs of all time. Let's Get It On's fantastic. Come Get to This, fantastic. Just a great session. And then What's Going On is one of the greatest records of all time in the pop genre. If you're talking pop, soul, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, whatever, What's Going On is one of the most important records of all time. And that spirituality and that consciousness and that social value that he's speaking of in this, it relates to Chuck D and Public Enemy, The Next Generation, and it echoes a guy like Coltrane and his spirituality and his mission quest the generation before. You know, Marvin really is connective tissue, a real spiritual giant and a monster of just beauty. You know, beauty. And what a sad ending for Marvin. One of the great artists of all time. I'm just going to flip through some stuff real quick here because, again, Pandora's Box means the diaspora just pushes you in all these directions. Brick, Great Atlanta, Soul Funk, the Dramatics, one of the great, I believe they're Philly soul. Fazio, Riding High, one of the great songs of the era. Isaac Hayes, the Shaft soundtrack. And it was, as I started diving deeper and deeper into this stuff, this is when my buddy said, dude, you should come do some DJing. Play some of these old records. And Gladys Knight, Midnight Train to Georgia's on here. But I got to use my imagination. What a killer number one that was on the R&B charts. I Want You by Marvin. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful song. The Staple Singers out of Los Angeles. Gospel Inflected Soul. The Shy Lights, A Lonely Man, which obviously stands for the Chicago Lights. Ooh, girl, I'd be in trouble if you left me. Tell Me, Have You Seen Her? Those songs are just timeless. This is a record I've beaten up and had to replace the sleeve on numerous times. Doing It to Death is one of the greatest songs ever. And Fred Wesley, I think it is, plays the trombone on there. And he's shaking down that gospel. He's bringing it all together. You know, and you can feel the roots of jazz and rhythm and blues throughout James Brown's work. Rose Royce, it's rose like the flower, Rose Royce. Car Wash is kind of the seminal hit that most people will know, but I Want to Get Next to You, great R&B track. The band Slave, a Dayton, Ohio band, they had a couple great funk disco crossovers. They're from that era after the disco burnout. And so it's when the charts kind of got re-separated under Reagan in the 80s. So a lot of white folks don't know SOS Band. They don't know Slave. Early 80s R&B, the production's really good. It hasn't got cheesy like that mid-80s, late 80s electro synth R&B, which is garbage. I love Barry White. His hits are great, but when you get a little deeper into Barry, songs for someone you love like this, where he's playing your game, man, if you can't shake your head to that, you're lost. Bobby Womack's 110th Street, classic soundtrack, a song that has validated me to a lot of old black men in the club DJing many times. William Devon, Be Thankful for What You Got. This is also in that vein. Leon Haywood, great outfit, by the way, with the old flappy ass panels. But this is I want to do something freaky to you, which Dr. Dre samples and Ain't Nothing But a G Thing. So people, when they hear it, they're like, oh, Dr. Dre. And then you're surprised because it's not Dr. Dre. Of course, Mothership Connection, Parliament, Funkadelic, that whole body of work's essential. The Spinners, another great Chicago, Detroit soul group. Earth, Wind, and Fire, one of the most talented bands of all time. War, it's a ghetto. The World is a Ghetto. I love a lot of War's records. The Cisco Kid and The World is a Ghetto was one of my favorites. OJ's Backstabbers, Love Train, Mr. Big Stuff, Gene Knight. Tough record to find on the Stax label. Bill Withers, his whole body of work's fantastic. Isaac Hayes, Hot Buttered Soul. This is probably his best record. People talk Shaft all the time, but the Shaft record's okay. Hot Buttered Soul is a great record that you can dive into from front to back. Willie Hutch has some great stuff. Kool and the Gang. Different eras of Kool and the Gang. 80s stuff was very highly produced and very vocal. Their 70s stuff was more just disco, jazz, funk, instrumental, a lot of it. Great stuff. Songs like Funky Stuff, Soul Vibrations, Jungle Boogie, Hollywood Swingin', been sampled. All the big hip-hop records of the 80s, 90s borrowed a lot from Kool and the Gang. And the Ohio Players, which I talked about not too long ago, one of the greatest funk R&B bands of all time. And so, again, the music just starts branching out for me. And it's all helping me kind of get back towards jazz. But it's all interwoven, the fabric. Once you realize that, it opens up your ears and your minds and your inhibitions and your, oh, I don't want to like that. You start to realize that you like what's good about it, and you find in most genres there's stuff that's really of value. And that opens your ears and makes you a better DJ and a better lover of music. There's so much value to be found across the musical horizons. And with the internet now, it's never been easier to dive into infinite different versions of the sound of music. So in the 90s, like I said, I went from metal into classic rock and slowly started discovering R&B. But there was a few moments where hip-hop, rap music interjects into my story. And it becomes a much bigger story once I started to become a DJ in the late 90s. But I'm going to back up a little bit. 1989, maybe 1990, when this record comes out, straight out of Compton, it just, even for a metalhead, there was a hardness and an edge to it and a sincerity and a desperation and a danger. And the sticker, the parental warning, this was one of those records that really started that whole concern with the message of black music again. And the FBI starts taking note once again. And, I mean, people have a right to cry for freedom. But I was living in Tennessee. I'd spent some time in Arizona. The FBI shut our job down. I went back to Minnesota for a while to hang out with some friends, and then I would get stuck there with the job situation and not having an apartment to go back to. They relocated to Tennessee, and I eventually rejoined them down there in Chattanooga. And Chattanooga had much more kind of old-fashioned laws, so they could get away with reopening that company. And when I was down there, there was a lot of crack and a lot of drugs, meth, coke. And 3 of my roommates were crackheads. So I actually smoked crack for a couple months, 3 months maybe. Never put my own money in on it because it wasn't good enough to me. I mean, an orgasm was more satisfactory and euphoric than a hit of crack. And that first hit of crack of the day is kind of euphoric, and the rest of the day you're like chasing after it. But we sit around playing spades, and we played spades a lot to Dr. Dre, The Chronic, and Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style. These came out in 93, 92. And so in 93, 94, these were 2 records that I opened my ears up to. The production was easy to get into. Dr. Dre was such a great producer that it was pretty simple for me. And I listened to those records a lot. And I kind of, when I moved back away from Tennessee, I kind of always still liked those 2 records, but I didn't stay with hip-hop at all. This is a fun gin and juice with a few fun remixes on there. And this is a Nothing But a G thing, 12-inch with some remixes on there. I got a lot of hip-hop vinyl from this era. This is a Dre Day 12-inch single, maxi pack. I mean, these 12 inches are great. I played it at parties infinitely. And when I started DJing, those were my, okay, I really want to kill the party right now records. That was my fallback on. That was my, okay, I really want this. What can I really kill them with? Gin and juice. That'll really get the party going. And it always worked. Gin and juice was always, and people weren't really playing gin and juice by the time I was DJing 2000, 2001, 2002. You know, Lil Wayne and Jay-Z, the scene had changed quite a lot. But I still think Gin and Juice is one of the greatest party songs of all time. And that G-Funk Parliament sound was just great production. That sounded great in the club. It was thick. And you play a lot of hip-hop from the 90s, and especially from the 80s. After Snoop Dogg or Dr. Dre, it's going to sound thin and echoey and ugly and viscous. Like, the Dre stuff's so thick and oily and well produced, it makes a lot of other hip hop sound inferior. And it's partly why I stayed so locked on Dre and Snoop. Because even Snoop without Dre, when he goes to that label, No Limit, his records aren't close to as good as they were with Dre making the beats. And so Dre was a real institution and a real harbinger of the sound that I could digest. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into hip-hop right here. And I know some of you are probably going to not watch this, and I guess that's fine. But hip-hop is a great way to get to understand jazz. Because hip-hop emceeing is as close to emoting and improvising into a horn as you can get. When an MC is freestyling, he's using inspiration around him. He's using kind of cliches that he relies on, little rhyme patterns that he knows. But he's also being inspired by the moment, who he's battling, just how he feels right now, the mood of his day. There's a lot of crossover between an improvised jazz solo and a hip-hop MC. And the other thing about hip-hop MCs is it'll drive home a couple things for you. The wide variation in what hip-hop can be message-wise. And if you don't like the message that exists in hip-hop, you probably don't like what jazz is really saying. I think that's a very important thing to get. And I think a lot of these audiophile people sit back there and they're listening to the notes and all, but they're not hearing the message. And these same people go, I don't like hip-hop, I don't like what... If you think that the guys in jazz are saying anything different into their horns, you don't understand history very well or how it feels to be oppressed. If anything, the guys in the jazz era were more oppressed and were speaking more militant and more resistant-filled, anarchic messages of, we're not going to take this anymore. And a lot of the Blue Note jazz that people so connect with today and think of as just kind of innocuous and without message, you couldn't be further from the truth. And if you want to get an idea of how disparate and how integral the message is in jazz. All you gotta do is look at the history of hip hop, and you'll get a great cross section of the variance that exists in MCs and how that same thing exists in soloists and jazz. I do want to mention a couple of records here real quick. Beastie Boys, in 95, 96 or so, Ill Communication comes out. It actually comes out in 92 or 93. This record really, it was okay for me to like this with my friends and my rock buddies. And I'm like, okay, Bill, you can dig that. You know what I mean? And which got me to Check Your Head. And to me, these are two of the great, they're derivative. They're obviously borrowing from black music and culture, but Ill Communication, which is right here, License to Ill, that's far more stealing from Run DMC and the sounds of the day. And Paul's Boutique, which is their second record, which I listen to also a lot, was also far more influenced by the rap of the current day. Check Your Head and Ill Communication really kind of push those limits and those boundaries, and they start playing some of their own instruments and bringing real musicians in. It's not just relying on the samples of the Dust Brothers. It's production and funk and pocket and space. And these records taught me a lot. How to play drums, how to feel hip-hop, how to feel rhythm and blues, how to understand hip-hop. And these records were played a ton in my house for a number of years. And they really were the door that opened up the rest of hip-hop to me beyond Dre and Snoop. And this is a little Root Down EP, which has some great versions on it. The version of Something's Got to Give is just killer on here. Some fun versions of Root Down. Cool little EP. I got a lot of Beastie Boy vinyl. But those records were really informative and opened up my perceptions. And I'm going to run through some history here because I think it's important. I think the Wu-Tang was the first thing I really said, okay, I like that, I can like this. And so, the first Wu Forever, Ghostface's first record, the Jizz's first record, Raekwon's first record, Method Man Tikal, Old Dirty Bastard's first record. I got into all that Wu-Tang stuff a lot. And after Forever, 97, 98, the production, the desperation, a lot of that kind of fades away. But 94, 95, 96, the Wu-Tang was cutting edge, and it was incredible. And it was very connected to other East Coast artists like Nas. And Nas, again, is one of the great MCs of that time. If you like Lee Morgan, you should like Nas. I mean, it's still a guy speaking from his soul to a beat. Morgan's waiting for the drummer, the bass, and the piano player to lay down a beat for him to improvise. Nas has that same principle at work. Street Dreams, nice little 12-inch. I got so much Nas stuff. And this whole wall here is wrapped. That whole wall back there is funk and soul. Redman kind of was in that same era. Jeru the Damager. Again, this is politically, socially conscious jazz. This guy spoke a lot about the issues of the day. And there's jazz players that are just as socially conscious as Jeru. But there's also jazz players who are just as party as Sugar Hill Gang. And there's a lot of parallels because they both kind of started off as party music, dance music, way to throw down and forget about your trouble music. And they both branch off into a broader assortment of sounds. The East Coast continues with things like the Fugees, which, I mean, I really, really, really listen to that record a lot. Just a collection of Fugees and Lauryn Hill stuff. Mobb Deep, straight up New York, intellectual with a hint of gangster. Some later Mobb Deep. I just pulled a few things out. Big Al from the Digging in the Crates crew. Biggie comes along and was a real transformative figure. And then, of course, Jay-Z was kind of the inheritance of the throne after Biggie. And then once you get to that East Coast, it kind of forces you to go backwards a little bit to understand the roots of those guys. And that's where I ended up going through, Grandmaster Flash, Scorpio, And, The Message with Melly Mel, one of the great hip-hop songs of all time. Curtis Blow, again, more party-induced rap. Kumo D, it's about partying and boasting. And then Slick Rick's kind of one of those door changers. He's the guy that kind of comes along and shakes things up a little bit. Maybe a bit of a Thelonious Monk with his storytelling and his eccentricity. Eric B. and Rakim, these two guys were the next level in the late 80s in terms of bringing hip-hop to that next generation. Follow the Leader. Rakim solo here. Boogie Down Productions. KRS-One. And Scott LaRock. Scott passed early on, leading KRS to make his own stuff. And KRS is just one of the great minds. EPMD had a lot of great records from that same era that were pushing a new kind of social agenda. You also had Public Enemy, who came along, and again, Rage Against the Machine, Public Enemy. There's jazz records that echo a lot of these same sentiments. Fear of a Black Planet. So it was the lyrics of Naughty by Nature. One of the real unheralded, forgotten about groups from the 90s was Naughty by Nature. So many great songs, very catchy, very accessible, but Tretch could really throw some rhymes down. Jam Jam. It's nice and smooth, again, from that late 80s, early 90s, Ultramagnetic MCs. Onyx really started to push that level. And it all leads into the Native Tongue era, which you had to start getting into that. Tribe Called Quest. More Tribe. I got a lot of Tribe, actually. Arrested Development, great record. De La Soul's records are all outstanding. Diggable Planets, I love both their records, really. Black Sheep, Brand Nubian, again, intellectual, spiritual, more Brand Nubian. Again, these different groups echo the same sentiments of a lot of the jazz labels. Some are more political, some are more party, some are more having a good time, some are more optimistic, some are more militant. Pete Rock and CL Smooth, great record with the great single They Reminisce Over You, My God. Gangstar, you gotta love Gangstar. Guru and DJ Premier, more Gangstar. Cool G Rap, DJ Polo, great New York East Coast stuff. X-Clan with some militant stuff. And if you think there's spiritual jazz that has some edge to it, a lot of this rap has that same desperation and same lack of conservative viewpoints. We're not going to shy away from telling you how we feel. All of this kind of opens me up to more West Coast stuff. So I got into stuff like Ice-T, who makes some good records. I got into Pac, hardcore. I love Pac. Bone Thugs were a revelation out of the Ohio area. That melodic MC singing style they did kind of really set the table for a lot of what's happening today. Ice Cube, of course, NWA heritage. More Ice Cube, and Cube makes some great records. Cypress Hill, their first two records are timeless. That was a nice day. More Pac. And so there's a lot of parallels here between this music and jazz. And then the last thing I want to show you hip-hop wise here is there was a movement in the late 90s, early 2000s of real intellectual, soul-filled, nicely produced, freestyle fellowship, Language of Violence by the Poor, Disposable Heroes of Hip-Hopocracy, which is actually the guy from Spearhead, whose name escapes me right now. The Far Side, great California hip-hop. Guru Jazzmatazz, who, of course, Guru is part of Gangstar. Jazzmatazz 1, Jazzmatazz 2, 3's in there somewhere, I just couldn't find it. I pulled enough stuff as it is. Common, they're the next great MCs to come along out of the Chicago area. Again, if you like Common, you'll like Coltrane. If you like Coltrane, you'll like Common. Souls of Mischief. Illadelph Half-Life by the Roots. The Roots made 4 or 5 great hip hop records in the 90s. Mos Def, Talib Kweli. One of my favorite records of all time is Black Star. And then Let's Get Free by Dead Prez. This is probably the pinnacle. And of all the free spiritual jazz out there that might offend people, Let's Get Free will do all that. It's a very powerful message on that record. So that kind of wraps up the hip-hop era and how that crossed over into my playing and my DJing, along with the funk and the soul, backed with the knowledge of the rock. And of course, you're also discovering the Roy Orbisons and the Elvises and the Little Richards and the Chuck Berrys and all the blues giants, Memphis Slim. So it really kind of spreads out in my 20s into all these different facets, all of which were preparing me for the next doorway into jazz itself. Kaya, the great record by Bob Marley, is one of my favorite records easily, and I still play it all the time. And Satisfy My Soul, Sun is Shining, and Could This Be Love? No, not Could This Be Love. Sun is Shining. I Don't Want to Wait. There's 3 songs lined up are 3 of the greatest songs in a row on any record ever. They're just killer stuff. I do want to mention real quick Portishead and Massive Attack. They were 2 bands I got into a lot in the mid-90s. I was mid-20s. And they opened me up to electronic music. There was enough hip-hop influence with the DJs and the scratching and the sampling mixed with the production and the conscious lyrics coming from a white British perspective. And, of course, there was some British black perspective in there as well. But the British gangster, the British experience is definitely different than the black experience here in America. You know what I mean? It's knives versus guns. There's violence and danger to be had in the United Kingdom, but not like there is in, you know what I mean, in America. Then 2 records that were really big for me was Blues and Order by Duke Ellington, a record I've talked about a lot over the years. And that record really was an eye-opener and an ear-opener. I love the joyous sound of it. Duke Ellington's greatest hits also with songs like I Don't Get Around Much Anymore and Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me with Al Hibbler. I mean, I got those records. I'm like, oh, that's good stuff. Take the A Train. But then it was Coltrane. And Coltrane was really the one that I connected with. And I have probably 75, 80 Coltrane albums. I'm a huge Coltrane fan. And I was addicted to Coltrane for probably 15 years. And when it was half of my jazz collection was Coltrane, another half it was Miles. You know what I mean? And there was like 20 records left over of other things. Some Red Garland and some, Freddie Hubbard. It was dominated by Miles and Coltrane for a long time. And Coltrane really spoke to me. The spiritualness, the avant-garde nature of it, the desperation, the integrity, all the elements that I loved. Coltrane has all that sincerity, that this is important, this is necessary, this isn't involuntary, this isn't an option, I have to do this. And that Neil Young, that Dylan, that John Lennon, all these essential characters, Coltrane embodied a lot of them, and most of them were influenced by Coltrane to some degree. And so Coltrane was like this glue that I couldn't get from rock and roll anymore what I was getting from Coltrane. That stuff that touched my soul and my spirit. And it was spiritual. It was like a bit like church. And so Coltrane, I can't really pick one record. I mean, I like a lot of his records, but there was such a wide variety of stuff that I was really into listening. I found Kulu Se Mama at my girlfriend's grandma's garage sale, and Expression as well, 2 pretty rare Coltrane Impulse records. And those were 2 of the ones I really dove into a lot, in part because of how I found them. And I really like Kulu Se Mama still to this day. But, I mean, there's my favorite things, Blue Train, the Prestige era. I like a lot of what Coltrane. And, of course, Coltrane with Ellington and Coltrane with Hartman are 2 of the greatest records of all time. And I think we'll talk about one of those for sure coming up in the next episode. But the only other record I want to mention right now is The Orb. And I loved The Orb. Dr. Alex Patterson, he's a very influential, creative mind. He actually worked with Brian Eno in Eno's studio in the 70s, in Edition Studio, as Eno was developing ambient sounds and those creative records he was making, from Another Green World to Air Music for Airports, Ambient 1 through 4, the records with Laraji and Harold Budd and John Hossel. All those records, a young Alex Patterson was there watching that unfold as an engineer, if I remember. And he borrows a lot from those records in his own music and samples them and takes some liberties. But I love The Orb, and Live 93 is one of the coolest records I've ever heard. I still listen to Live 93 a lot today. I love it. I love the samples. I love the vocal snippets. I've seen them live a couple times, and it was just fantastic. He's had various people come through his group over the years, but it's pretty much Dr. Alex Patterson project. He also remixed a bunch of Pink Floyd records. I only have a couple of them. I have Dark Side and maybe Wish You Were Here. I have 2 or 3 of them that he remixed, and they were only available as bootlegs here in America. I found a couple in a record store, but they were expensive, like $30 a CD, so I only could get a couple. But they're cool stuff. And how we got access to those Floyd vaults to edit that stuff and play with them and remix them, it'd be a story I'd love to know about. Momentary Lapse is one of the other ones I have. I have a remix of that. I'm not even positive it's Dr. Alex Patterson, but there's some of the same samples, so I'm pretty sure it is him. And I know he had access to a lot of interesting things and with Eno and his connections. So me and my friends were always pretty sure it was Patterson behind it, but not positive. So that wraps up my 20s. A pretty wide swath that opened me up to a lot of things that set me up to DJ the next 20 years and set me up to eventually have a jazz channel talking about music and race and integrity and spirituality and the power and the value of music. Music's not just entertainment. Music is an expression of my condition. And if my condition is troubled, my music will reflect that. And that's important. And it also gives a voice to the ones who history deemed voiceless. History is written by the winners of the great wars. The losers of those wars get to make art, get to write poems and make music that history will remember because of the oppression that they overcame via that art. That's the Lord is my shepherd has power because it helped people survive. And music has played that role here in America, especially with the Black experience. And that's the power of the music. That's why it makes my hair stand on end at times. I mean, this hair is too long to do that now, but these hairs can still do it at times. So that wraps up my 20s. Got a little long-winded, but I wanted to share some of that stuff with you because if you dove into those hip-hop MCs I just showed you, and if you knew X-Clan, and if you knew Gang Starr and Guru, and if you knew The Tribe Called Quest, and if you knew De La Soul, and The Roots, and Common, and Mos Def, and Talib Kweli, and Eric B. and Rakim, and, just go down to Chuck D. You go down that list of great MCs, it'll give you some idea of the variance that jazz players' personalities are projecting. And that same range of Black experience from the party, we just want to have a good time, to the social revolution that some people want to address, jazz covers that same spectrum. And it's photos of a guy, how often does he smile, his experience and his environment. It was all those things, that those brushstrokes I've talked about many times, that can help you understand what a jazz player is emoting. And if you don't like the message in hip-hop, if you don't like what Common and Nas and the RZA has to say, you probably shouldn't be listening to jazz. You probably shouldn't. You're doing it a disservice. And the last thing I want to say today, and I'm not going to harp on the hi-fi audiophile thing. I'm trying to avoid it as much as possible. But can you imagine? Let's just go with John Coltrane and the Blue Train reissue and the melee of internet conversation about Blue Train's reissue. And can you imagine him eavesdropping in and listening to someone talk about the pressing for 40 minutes and never once mentioning the music or the man who made the music? I mean, if I've made music and made art and didn't writing my whole life. And if I was listening to someone who was reviewing my music 50 years from now, and all they were talking about was the medium that the music came to them on, and that this version is better than that version, but there was no mention of me and what I was trying to say and what I was trying to get across to you, I would think you are wasting my time. You haven't heard a thing that I was trying to get across. And I think there's a lot of musicians resting somewhere going, man, I'm glad they're buying the record, but fuck, they know nothing about it. They haven't heard anything I was trying to say. And so I think that's partly why I get indignant sometimes. I'm like, man, the music's what matters. What is the guy trying to tell us? What is his experience is weighing him down, and where is he trying to reveal to us through this music? And I think if someone's just sitting there talking about all that other stuff and ignoring the musician and the message, that most of those musicians would not be super happy. It's just my thought. I can't imagine that any of them would be super thrilled hearing you break down their record and never once mention their life story or their emotional content or the struggles they went through or what the music is probably trying to relay to us. So just something to think about. I made a pretty good mess back here with all the classic rock, R&B, and hip-hop I've pulled out. Reggae interjects into my life as well at that time, but I'm going to cut this off right here. Tune in next time where we're going to jump into the music of my 30s. And my 30s and my 40s are a little tougher to narrow down because I was diving into jazz a lot. And I also had so many more records at that point that it was hard to get that same amount of, I'm going to play this record and only this record for 2 weeks. You know what I mean? I'm going to play this record 100 times this year. And that gets tougher and tougher as I've gotten older. And my collection's getting wider and wider. And there's so much I want to listen to and try to learn about and try to digest. So picking out records I listened to and loved in my 40s, the same way I listened to and loved a record in my 20s, it was a very different and challenging experience. And I did find some, and there's some that are kind of like a little iffy, but I still had enjoyed putting this together. So stay tuned for the next episode. We'll talk to you all soon. Subscribe if you haven't. Appreciate your comments and feedback. What do you think of hip-hop? What do you think of classic R&B soul music? Do you like that funk music? Do you see how it connects to jazz? And that you can't understand jazz and hear jazz if you don't understand rhythm and blues, if you don't understand even hip-hop. And there's no better way to understand what a jazz player is speaking than to hear MCs speak and to hear the wide variation in what that message could be. And if you think any of those jazz players are just sitting back thinking about notes and composition and playing revelatory, new ingenious ways of sequencing note sequence, that's not part of it. It's just expressing the ugly, the yuck that's in my soul today. And when you're a black man in America, it's not hard to find that yuck. And if you don't like the message in rap, and if you don't like the message in hip-hop, you probably don't really like jazz either. Because there's just no way they're sitting talking about nonsense. There's just no way they're sitting back talking about silliness. There's too much seriousness to discover and to discuss. We'll talk to you all soon. Have a great day. My name is Dan the Jazz Shepherd. Peace. One little tidbit, I can't not mention this. Outkast of Clemini. This is the southern branch of hip-hop. First Outkast let them play Holistic Cadillac music. Goody Mob, who were kind of friends and Atlanta mates on the same label as Outkast. This was the first southern rap that really spoke to me. And I listened to Clemini thousands of times. That's a great record. One of the best hip-hop records ever, along with Black Star, both from 1998. Like Water for Chocolate by Common. But man, Aquemini and Black Star, those two records are two of the best hip-hop records you'll ever hear, along with Dead Prez, Let's Get Free. Peace.